This is part 2 of an ongoing series. I recommend watching the first part on the Xenogears series first in order to get caught up, otherwise I will be assuming that you already did. After Square decided to put their focus solely on the Final Fantasy series, Takahashi and several of the staff involved in Xenogears became dissatisfied with the state of the company and decided to leave in order to fund their own company. While searching for a publisher to fund their games, most declined. However, they eventually found someone in Namco, as its founder, Masaya Nakamura, shared a lot of the team's ideals. And so, on October 1st, 1999, Monolith Software was born, as a Namco subsidiary. After this, they'd then proceed to take a year to gather sufficient staff in order to start developing their first major project, culminating in a development cycle that lasted around 2 years and a budget of 1 billion yen. And so, in 2002, the world was given Xenosaga Episode 1, Der Wille zur Macht. Xenosaga 1 is a weird game. I like it, but it's extremely rough around the edges. It's clear that a lot of the staff was still wet behind the ears. Everything from the visuals to the combat to the dungeon design lacks a certain polish that you'd expect from this kind of game. Yet I won't deny that there is some charm to it all. Since the story of this game isn't self-contained but one continuous narrative, I'll keep talking about it in greater detail for after we've discussed Xenosaga 3, as that marks the end of the series. I will however be referring to it whenever it's relevant, so instead let's talk about the gameplay. Saga 1's general area structure differs quite a bit from Gears. Instead of a large open world map that connects every individual area, the game possesses something more akin to a level structure. Each area counts as its own stage of sorts, with the player automatically being transported to the next one once they beat the current one. There are primarily two kinds of these stages. The first are the dungeon levels, which have a layout about on par with the complexity of the ones in Gears. The second are the towns, where you can buy equipment, though as the series goes on, the need for those is eventually entirely fizzled out by the shop spots within dungeons themselves. Sometimes, when towns are particularly big, they'll actually have a sort of overworld map to themselves for travel between the individual areas within said town. At any point, you can use the EVS system to instantly teleport to the entrance of any place you've been to before, including dungeons, to get any items you might have missed or the like. This structure is entirely consistent throughout all three of the main games. But you know what isn't? Literally anything else. This isn't even an exaggeration. Despite every game continuing the same story, they could not be any more different from one another. Combat, music, voice actors, visuals, and even area layouts are never consistent across all three games. For now, let's not get ahead of ourselves and stick to Saga 1 specifically. Then we can discuss the differences in the later games when we get to them. The combat in Saga 1 is extremely ambitious if nothing else. Much like in Gears, you have a set number of action points and can use as many attacks per turn as you have AP left. And that's about where the similarities end. Defending for a turn and having some AP left over in general now carries over to the next turn. Each turn you get 4 and you can have up to 6 at any time. Having a full AP meter then allows you to use a special attack by pressing a third button after the first two inputs. These input chains are referred to as tech attacks and you can customize them however you want, setting up to 4 low ones and 2 high ones, with tech attacks having different elemental attributes and some being ranged, which actually ties into the next thing. There's a row system now and it's entirely pointless. As you'd expect, the back row takes less damage but can only attack ranged. The only time this is ever relevant is during one specific fight in the endgame that can forcefully put your characters to the back. Honestly, the same can be said about most of the shit in this game. For instance, after each battle you gain experience as you'd expect, but you also gain tech points, ether points, and skill points. Ether points let you unlock new ether spells, which you can also transfer to other characters if you like, though you have to manually equip them after unlocking them, which threw me off a couple of times. Tech points let you increase individual stats, and skill points let you extract skills from items so you can permanently gain their passes on your character. These are, in theory, really cool. But the issue is that the game gives you very little of each after any battle. I was already more than halfway through the game by the time I had enough SP on Shion to extract even a single useful skill. The ether skills you can unlock are cool and all, but not transferring Medica All, which is the game's standard party heal spell to all your characters, is essentially setting yourself up for failure. They just probably realized that the points they give you just aren't enough, so they made it a pain in the ass to escape from battles. It's something you can only do if you're either using Shion's goodbye ether attack, or if you use a dedicated item. Now granted, the items are cheap and the spell uses only a single ether point, but the game should have just had a dedicated escape button. Anyway, back to the combat proper, because here's yet another mechanic that is severely undercooked. The AGSS, or AUGs for short, function as Saga 1's gear replacement. In their same vein, you can summon them at any point in battle and do some good damage depending on the equipment you give them, though they can't heal others. Unlike Gears, they also don't use use up fuel, but ammo instead. I'd go into them some more, but the issue is that they're kinda pointless. By the time you're halfway through the game, your own characters will be more than capable enough to keep up with them and even outperform them quite easily. As AUG's upgrades are extremely expensive and just not that useful after a certain point early on. And then there's yet another completely underutilized mechanic. Every turn is assigned a certain bonus effect, which can range anywhere from gaining more money after a fight to increasing critical damage. This is completely negligible for anything but a single boss fight. Now I know this section has been pretty negative so far, but there is one really fucking good mechanic in here, though it had yet to be refined. Whenever your characters take and deal damage, they slowly raise a boost meter. Once it's full, you can use it up to force that character's turn to come next, assuming certain conditions are met, of course. This mechanic is really cool and would be the one combat related thing that sticks around for the rest of the series, though it gradually changed for the better, which we'll get into later. All of this becomes completely irrelevant in the endgame. You see, throughout the games you'll constantly come across secret doors labeled segment addresses. Returning to them with the corresponding decoder lets you enter them to find some sort of secret item. In Saga 1 specifically, these sometimes contain robot parts. The more you find them bring to a certain NPC, the more you obtain secret ether attacks for Shion, which are all incredibly strong in their own right. However, giving them all unlocks the Kaiser. Aside from following in Gears' footsteps by having a mandatory Gao Gaiga reference, it is also the strongest attack in the game. It may consume a shit ton of EP, however, once you use it and the lengthy animation plays, which you can thankfully skip with the start button, and then it deals a flat 9,999 damage to every enemy. This includes the final boss. Well, every enemy other than it doesn't have anywhere close to that much health actually, so that completely trivializes the endgame portion of the game. This is going to become a theme as you'll see. However, super bosses do exist, and amongst them is one that must never be forgotten. Grey Joe is the epic. He loves gunslinging. Do not break the wardrobes in the Elsa, because this fight is fucking bullshit. That's it for the gameplay, so let's talk about the music. This game would mark the last time that Mitsuda would be composing for the series in a very long time. So you'd hope that it's really good in that case, right? Well, yeah. It's a fantastic soundtrack and every track sounds like it'd perfectly fit into Xenogears. The issue is that there's not much of it. The soundtrack has over 50 songs, yet they're mostly relegated to cutscenes. There's only a single battle theme in the entire game. Be it for random enemies or bosses, they all have the exact same music. The only exception is the final boss's theme, which is in reference to the final boss of Gears. This track will make you go insane. I hear the opening sting in my fucking sleep. Thanks to the bigger budget and better hardware of this game, Xenosaga actually features full voice acting for all of its cutscenes. Now, Xenogears did have voice acting as well, however I didn't think to mention it until now as it was relegated to battle grunts and very sparse animated cutscenes. The English dub of the Saga series is incredibly hit or miss. There are instances where I actually prefer the English cast, such as with Albedo and Jin in Saga 2 and 3, however sometimes the Japanese dub is simply far and away superior. The English dub also suffers from another very big problem. The voice cast does not stay consistent. Most of the core cast got completely replaced for 2, yet almost all of them came back for Saga 3, barring some characters. Because of this, playing through the series in English can be extremely jarring, which is a shame since the dub in Saga 3 especially holds up damn well. In Japan on the other hand, the cast wasn't just consistent, but lots of voice actors actually reprised their roles as the archetypes from Gears. As an example, Hideyuki Tanaka, who voiced Satan in Gears, voices Jin in this series, and Yumi Toma, who voices Ellie in Gears, voices Nephilim in Saga. It's a minor detail, but one that fans of both will definitely come to appreciate, especially since the Japanese cast of Saga is really fucking good. Something you've all probably realized by now, however, is that Saga 1 isn't a particularly pretty game, to say the least. The series has always struggled with its visuals, and I'd argue that it wouldn't be until Saga 3 that they finally reached a good aesthetic. Saga 1 is a game I personally find both ugly in art direction and art style. Saga 2 I believe looks great in concept art, perfectly nailing the vibe these games go for, however in execution it looks absolutely abysmal and extremely uncanny, which is only made worse by the fact that some characters still use their Saga 1 models, which results in a pretty irritating contrast. Saga 3's direction is comparatively simpler than 2's, however it results in a game that looks honestly pretty fucking good for 2006 with visuals that hold up damn well to this day. Now that we've covered everything else, let's touch on the story of Saga 1, which is simultaneously its greatest strength and biggest flaw. The main issue is that it's a prologue more than anything else. The characters are all introduced and the greater conflicts and storylines are set up. However, it's all foreshadowing, as practically none of the questions posed by this game are actually answered in it. Hell, some of the shit that gets foreshadowed doesn't even become relevant until episode 3. A good example of this is the subtitle, Der Wille zur Macht, or in English, The Will to Power. It's a concept coined by German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche Nietzsche. In the same vein, both Episode 2, Jenseits von Gut und Böse, and Episode 3, also Sprach, Zarathustra, are named after his works as well. The series is generally chock full of Nietzschean concepts, and his philosophy plays a key role throughout not just the series, but all of Xeno. However, Xenosaga 1 is so focused on being a setup for what's to come that it's easy to forget that this is the case. It's part of the reason why I've seen so many people call this game pretentious when it really isn't. I like this game, I really do, but it's difficult to recommend to someone as a standalone package because it's simply incomplete, especially since the ending shows off snippets of things that won't get relevant until way later down the line. I won't get into details as I promised, however, I may as well go into the main party's archetypes again, that way we have something to work with until later parts of the video. Shion is a giant hypocritical bitch and encompasses the context, while simultaneously possessing the brains of the Usuki archetype. KOS-MOS is a cross between the anti-type and the Kasim's emotional growth. Junior is a mix between Bart and Billy, whilst also looking like a younger Jesseya. Momo is a cross between Choo-Choo, Maria and Esmeralda. Ziggy is like Ricardo except he's German instead of Mexican, and Chaos possesses traits from Satan, though he's more of a wildcard than anything, for reasons I'll get to when we finally discuss spoilers. Saga 2 and 3 also feature one more party member in the form of Shion's brother, Jin. This guy is literally just Satan to a core. He is also my favorite of the bunch for reasons we'll also be discussing later. And so we've reached the end of Xenosaga 1, which ended up becoming a smash hit, being the 7th best-selling game of 2002 and spawning an entire multimedia franchise. But before we get to all the side material it spawned, let's talk about this little oddity is a Japan-only re-release of the first game. It primarily adds two things, the first being some costumes for KOS-MOS and Momo, and the other being a cutscene viewer. Where things get interesting, however, is the cutscenes themselves. You see, this version of the game exclusively features the English dub of the game. Not only that, but it seems to be an older version than the one in the Western release, as it features several differences in certain phrases being used. Furthermore, the cutscenes use the censored English versions. This actually leads me to talk about the censorship in these games for a bit. This segment will contain minor spoilers for all three main games, so if you'd rather not hear about that, please skip to the Xenosaga Freaks segment, but only two things were censored in this game. There's a scene in which a character rips his head off, and some other things involving him. In the Japanese version, he does this with a knife. Almost all of it is covered by a black fog, and you can't really see much of it. In English, he uses his bare hands to do that, and you can see the head rolling on the floor. Personally, I find this censored version way more graphic than the original. Xenosaga 2 had a similar case where, again, everything like blood and whatnot was left entirely unchanged. However, they replaced someone shooting themselves in the head with a gun, with them using an energy sphere instead, though the ensuing blood splatter remained. Saga 3, on the other hand, is by far the most violent of the three games, yet the English version has all instances of blood removed, which really fucks over a lot of the environmental storytelling in my opinion. But yeah, that's about all I have to say about Reloaded. Xenosaga Freaks is the first spin-off in the series, and is kind of comparable to something like Tales of Fandom, wherein it's a compilation of multiple things. There are 4 modes in this game, if you can call them that. I'll just go through them in order of relevancy. The first is an encyclopedia of terms used throughout Saga 1. It's kind of similar to the database in Saga 3, which we'll get to later. The next is Kotoba no Puzzle, Xenopetan, which is just a Xenosaga reskin of Namco's Kotoba no Puzzle Mojipatan series. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's basically Japanese Scrabble. The third mode takes up a bulk of the game, that being Xeno Komi. This is a lighthearted visual novel set sometime during the events of Saga 1, and actually happens to be canon. It never takes itself seriously and really plays into the silliness of it all, which contrasts the nature of the series' main games instead. If you ever wanted to see KOS-MOS or Momo as catgirls, then this is the game for you. What helps is that some fans actually translated most of the available routes and even ported them to PC, so shoutouts to that. Now the last mode is a simple demo of Xenosaga 2. This demo contains the entire prologue to the game, and to my knowledge does not have any difference to the final release. Though I may be wrong on that, as I didn't explicitly look for any while playing through it. In a perfect world, this would be a perfect segue into episode 2, which would technically come next in release order. However, before we do that, I'd first like to dedicate some time to the adaptations of episode 1. The anime sucks. There is no sugarcoating it, this is just a bad show. It fails both as a standalone series and especially as an adaptation. Aside from the obvious stuff like just flat out being extremely ugly and the animation being very awkward to look at, it also just suffers from a lot of pacing issues. Not to mention the story was greatly altered and mostly for the worse. Things like the introductory segments for Ziggy and Junior are completely absent, leading to them joining the party being extremely jarring, as the characters were not properly established prior. And entire areas and characters were completely completely cut for virtually no reason. Instead, they added an all-new character named Kirsch, who really doesn't add anything of value to the story at all. I know this might sound like a lot of nitpicking, but for a game consisting almost entirely of foreshadowing, this shit really adds up, and ends up causing a lot of problems with consistency later down the line. Even the dub is a downgrade. Practically none of the voice actors from the game returned for the show. I'll be the first to admit that the dub in the game is very flawed, but this show's dub is on a whole new level of bad. Practically the only saving grace of the anime is the fact that its lead writer, Yuichiro Takeda, would end up being the writer for several Xeno games going forward, more specifically the DS ports of Saga 1 and 2 and the entire Blade series. I'm mentioning this because I think it's funny that a man such as him would end up being involved with Xeno, as those games heavily reference Sunrise's Brave series, which he also wrote for in the past. The manga fares a little better than the anime, though it does come with some issues of its own. For one, it was allegedly written by a guy named Atsuhi Baba. I don't think this guy even exists, because for the life of me, the only thing I could ever find about him was this manga. For the most part, it follows the events of the game pretty faithfully, barring the occasional cutscene here and there. However, I can't seem to find out whether or not more than the initial 4 volumes even existed, so I'm absolutely clueless if the manga was ever even finished or not. At the very least, what is there has been translated by fans into English. Now, before we move on to episode 2, I'd first like to talk about Xenosaga Outer File. This is a series of 3 drama CDs following multiple series of events, some during and some shortly after Saga 1. Much like Xenokomi, these are canon, though hardly important to the grander narrative, serving more as fun side material to bridge the gap between games. The most important thing about them is that they introduce the characters Richard and Herman, who serve as recurring bosses throughout both Saga 2 and 3, as well as serving some additional world building. Much like for Xenokomi, some fans also got together to translate them and turn them into a Flash-based pseudo-visual novel, so that's a nice way of going about reading them. Xenosaga Episode 2, Jenseits von Gut und Böse, is quite possibly the worst Xeno game ever made, and that fucking sucks, for a large variety of reasons really. You see, this game was actually my and many people's first exposure to Xeno as a whole. Europe never got Xenogears or Episode 1, thus this was the first game in the series I ever played. So you might be wondering, well, how were people meant to follow the story if they couldn't play the first game? And the answer is this. PAL copies of the game came with a special DVD that contained a collection of every single cutscene of Episode 1. It was basically like those XJRPG, the movie videos that you can find on YouTube, that are totally disjointed arrangements of every cutscene with jarring transitions at every spot where there should be a fight. I really wish I could say this game is better than most people give it credit for, but I simply cannot. This game is an absolutely soul-sucking experience, and despite being barely 30 hours long, feels like it takes an eternity. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, and let's run it down from the top. The opening portion of the game is genuinely fantastic. The Miltian conflict is a major event mentioned multiple times throughout the series, and being able to play through a portion of it is extremely cool. And not only do they introduce the new ES battles, but it also introduces most of the relevant mechanics in a pretty interesting way. And then they cap it off with this genuinely really fucking awesome mo-capped sword fight between Jin and Margulis, only for them to never expand on anything in terms of mechanics and have absolutely nothing ES related until Disc 2, as well as immediately cutting back to the present where things aren't nearly as interesting anymore. Combat has changed a lot, but unfortunately not for the better. Let's talk about it. While your attacks still consist of several button inputs in a certain order, attacks are now attributed to one of 3 areas, A, B, and C, or in normal people terms, high, middle, and low. Every enemy has some sort of weakness to a certain combination of these, like BBC or ABCC. The way you achieve these specific orders is by effectively using boosts, which is essentially unchanged from the first game. However, they are now a shared resource amongst all characters and you can charge up to 3 of them at any given time. Once you hit the target's weakness, they become toppled and can be launched, allowing you to do much more damage. This is something that would actually end up coming back in the Blade games. There's also the ability to move behind enemies in order to do even more damage with back attacks. Once unlocked, you can also use boost on certain characters to enable them to use special partner attacks, which honestly look really fucking cool. And hell, you can even swap out characters mid-battle now. Augs are also completely gone and never to be seen again. Instead, you now have the aforementioned ES units, which are much closer to how gears functioned in, well, xenogears, as in being completely standalone fights with their own weapons and equipment that actively need to be upgraded, and can't really be ignored. In this game, however, they're essentially just an extension of normal battles, and so really aren't that interesting. Now, all of this sounds just fine and dandy, right? Too bad they ruined it in frankly the worst way they possibly could have. For one, the way skills are reworked fucking sucks. Every character is practically the same now because everyone gets the same exact skill tree, and it is the most tedious thing in the world to deal with. To unlock a new skill, you first have to get enough of 2 separate types of skill points per battle, then use the first to unlock the subtree, then select a specific subgroup within that subtree to select one of 4 skills to unlock with the second currency, and to unlock the next best subtree, you first have to have fully unlocked a subgroup within the prior subtree. However, sometimes skills within a subgroup are locked and can't be unlocked until some specific and sometimes random ass conditions have been met. This would be nothing more than an annoying inconvenience if the game didn't give you as few skill points as Ebenezer Scrooge pays his employees. I'll be honest, for most of my time on this playthrough, I just used to save carryover rewards from Saga 1. Which is a swimsuit for Ziggy and KOS-MOS, as they're much better equips than most of the shit you're ever gonna get out of the skill tree. The worst part of it all is that the enemies in this game have health out the fucking ass. Everyone is ridiculously spongy, and it takes forever to kill even the weakest of low-level grunts. And don't even think of breezing through the endgame, because guess fucking what? Kaiser is completely inaccessible until the post-game, so what is even the point? So let's say you don't want to deal with that right now, and you just want to rush your ass to the next save point. Well, you can actively run from battles now. Just a tiny issue. Only specific characters can do that, like Shion or Momo. I have no fucking idea why they did that, but it is just completely pointless. By far the worst part of this game, however, has to be the new side quest system. If you want to effectively level up, or get any sort of good progress in, you'd best be prepared to engage with this dogshit system, consisting entirely of tedious fetch quests, barring like a couple of exceptions, because half the best gear and equipment in this game is stuck behind it. And don't even think about ignoring the side quests and just progressing the main story, because you won't be anywhere near prepared enough to take it on half the time without doing this shit. Simply put, Xenosaga Episode 2 is a 15-hour game stretched to 30 with some of the worst side content I've ever had the displeasure of being forced to experience in a JRPG. By the time I was done replaying this game, I just wanted to take a nap because I was just completely drained. Even the story didn't escape being extremely flawed. I sure fucking hope you like Albedo and Junior, because this game is all about them, and everyone else gets almost completely sidelined. And I really don't think I have to get into the visuals. This game is simply fucking ugly, no matter how you slice it. Even the dub isn't safe, as half the cast was completely replaced for literally no reason like I'd mentioned earlier. And while most of the first game's voice actors did come back for free, some of them did retain their Saga 2 voices, also as I'd mentioned before. However, while this is extremely jarring, I will not deny that some of the voice actors for 2 are much better than the ones in 1. But all of this just really fucking sucks because there's genuinely a lot of good buried underneath this giant steaming pile of shit. The story, whilst extremely junior-centric, is pretty fucking good, and the music is, in my humble opinion, the best in the entire franchise. Starting with this game, the music for the series would end up being composed not by Yasunori Mitsuda, but by one Yuki Kajiura, whom some of you might know from her work on shows like Madoka Magica or the Many.Hack anime. She did a fantastic job blending together the Celtic influence and general instrumentations established by Mitsuda with a fresh sounding sci-fi tone, perfectly befitting of the space drama oriented series. I cannot name a single song in this game that ended up being grating or otherwise unenjoyable. It's just an all-around fantastic soundtrack. It also introduces one of my favorite tracks in a video game, Fatal Fight, which we'll get more into in the Saga 3 and spoiler sections. I feel like a lot of the game's flaws can be attributed to the fact that Takahashi took a very hands-off approach for this game, which is to say he gave the team the general story outline and fucked off. Ultimately, this would also end up being the last time Soraya Saga would write for a Perfect Works game, and to add insult to injury, the game sold extremely poorly, in spite of actually having been released in Europe for once, reaching just over 50% of Namco's projected sales target. But thankfully, that doesn't mean that the series was over, far from it. Just by looking at the time left on the video, you can easily tell that there's still quite a bit left to go. Pied Piper is infuriating, not because it's bad, but because it's really fucking good, and yet nobody can play it anymore. The only real way to experience the game these days is to watch a playthrough of it on YouTube, and if you don't understand Japanese, read the fan translation of the entire script, and this is something you absolutely should do. Pied Piper is set about 100 years before the events of the first game, and follows the life of Ziggy before his eventual death and resurrection as a cyborg. This is genuinely one of the best stories in the franchise, and without it, Ziggy's entire arc in the third game simply doesn't work. The dynamic between Yun and his subordinates is really good, and the slow realization of what is going to happen as the story progresses is fantastic. There's so much to unpack here, and all of it is written wonderfully. This is genuinely one of the most important parts of the Xenosaga story. Hell, I'd argue it's more important than half the shit that happens in the first game, and it sucks that its playable form is stuck as lost media. There's a small chance that the game may someday be re-released as part of the Gmod archives library, but that has yet to happen. And even then, from what I can tell, the gameplay seems to be the same as Saga 1, with visuals and music that are about on par with what you'd expect from an old Japanese mobile game. If you do intend on playing through the series, then I implore you to go through at the very least the script of this game before playing Saga 3. This is a remake of both Xenosaga 1 and 2 as a single game for the DS, and if you think this sounds like a horrible idea and a recipe for disaster, well, you'd be forgiven. The story is the one thing in the game that has received the least changes. It adjusts some events from Saga 2 to be more in line with the first game, such as giving Momo a bow in Xenosaga 1 instead of a rod so it lines up with the later games, or moving around some bits of the story for a better narrative flow. It also adapts the entirety of Outer Files, as well as adding several new scenes and side stories that expand on the world, which can be unlocked as you progress throughout the games. The gameplay, on the other hand, has seen a lot of changes. Both games now use the same combat system, which is essentially the same as in Saga 1, however you can actively walk around the battlefield. Unfortunately, this comes with a caveat. There are random encounters again, and lots of them at that. I was really hoping there'd be no more after Xenosaga 1 got rid of them, but unfortunately not. However, they did also add the ability to press L whenever highlighted text appears in order to get a little database entry on it, which can definitely help alleviate some of the overwhelming exposition dumps in the first game. Aesthetically, this version's dialogue, sprites, and cutscenes take a lot after the anime, which makes sense as most of the team involved in the game's development had previously worked on said anime. The characters all retained their Saga 1 designs throughout the entire story, barring KOS-MOS, whose model gets upgraded early into Saga 2, and also Jin, who now uses the same combat suit that he also wears in a missing year, which we'll get to later. The battle and overworld sprites, on the other hand, take directly after xenogears, in a decision that I personally find quite pleasing. By far the strangest thing about this game has to be the soundtrack. Neither Mitsuda nor Kajiura composed it. Instead, the job went to Kosuke Yamashita, who had previously scored for the anime and did a pretty good job at imitating Mitsuda's tone, so he's not a bad composer at all. But I have to wonder, what the fuck happened here? The music has always been an important part of the series' identity, yet this soundtrack doesn't fit at all. It lacks any of the Celtic influences and instead just sounds like something you'd hear in a SNES Final Fantasy knockoff. It doesn't fit the tone that the games are going for whatsoever, and it's simply jarring to listen to. Another thing is that due to the game's sprite-based nature, it loses a lot of the cinematic nature of the console games, which was kind of one of their big selling points. Other than these issues though, I'd consider this to be the definitive version of Saga 2. However, you'd have to play through all of Saga 1 to reach the Saga 2 portions of the game, and these remakes were never translated, neither officially nor by fans, so knowing Japanese is your only real way of playing these versions of the games, I'm afraid. I actually don't have a lot to say or show about the identity device. It was basically just an executable you could load onto your PC that would connect to the official Xenosaga servers and function as a sort of online newsletter for the series. A neat novelty, if not a clear product of its time. Missing Year is a browser-based visual novel which bridges the rather large time skip between Xenosaga 2 and 3, and that is extremely important to Saga 3's larger narrative. What Pied Piper is to Ziggy, Missing Year is to Jin. His character gets fleshed out a lot more than it did in Saga 2, and it adds a lot to his dynamic with Shion, who by this point in the story is slowly but surely breaking down. Giving this part of the story is not optional. It is absolutely necessary to fully understand both Shion and Jin as well as their actions in Saga 3. And thankfully it was entirely archived and translated, and you can easily find it on YouTube. It does however come with a couple of problems. For one, it incoherently jumps around the timeline every now and then, which can lead to it being a bit confusing sometimes, though that's usually not a big deal thanks to its short runtime, being barely over an hour long. Unfortunately, it also has some highly compressed audio, and the quality of the art varies greatly across the chapters. Nonetheless, this is absolutely a must read for anybody playing through the series. Before we move on to episode 3, I'd first like to go through some of the interesting side materials in the series, starting with Weekly Xenosaga. This is, as the name implies, a series of magazines promoting the release of their respective games, with each of the 3 games getting several volumes of the magazine each. These usually include lots of previews of the game, information on the characters, concept arts, and special artwork. These are in no way important, but the art exclusive to them is pretty cool. Xeno Emissions is a series of 3 concept art collections by series production designer Koichi Eiichi Mugitani, better known by his alias Choco. Whilst Tanaka was still a character designer for Saga 1 and 2, Choco would primarily be the one to design the mechs and whatnot, though he'd actually take over as character designer for Saga 3 as well. He still works at Monolith, doing key art for Xenoblade 3 and having actively designed the mechs for Xenoblade X, which was a similar situation to Saga 1, as Tanaka would actually return to design the games as characters as well. I do recommend looking into Xeno Emissions, as the mechs throughout the series have some pretty awesome and intricate character designs behind them, and I'm generally just a sucker for seeing concept art like this. Just make sure not to read too far, or else you run into some questionable artwork. Much like its elder brother, Xenosaga also received some 4-koma, and really everything I said about the Gears ones applies here as well. Some are quite funny, others aren't, and the art style constantly jumps around thanks to having several artists working on it. Just be mindful that unlike the xenogears 4-koma, these ones haven't been translated. And also like Gears, Saga received a comic anthology, which, much like the 4-koma, hasn't been translated. And once again, I can only repeat myself, some stories are serious, others are comedic, some are funny, others aren't, and the art style constantly shifts. I will say this though, I don't think that the serious stories for Saga add as much to its role and characters as the ones for Gears do. Now before we move on, there's one more manga I'd like to talk about. You see, there used to be this little series called the Super Comic Gekijo, created by Square Enix, which would make several small comic anthologies, each volume dedicated to a different video game. They did ones for several series from many different companies like Tales of, or Radiata Stories, or even Toshinden, as well as some other series that my hatred for prevents me from mentioning. Basically anything they could get their hands on, they'd make one for. And as fate would have it, Xenosaga would also end up there, under volume 52. This one's really fun. It's just multiple writers having fun and goofing off with the characters and setting, and I found it to be quite funny at times as well. Again, completely untranslated though, so that's a shame. But that's enough about side material for now. It's time to discuss the one thing that justifies this entire dauntless journey of a franchise in my eyes. Xenosaga Episode 3, also Sprach Zarathustra, is one of my favorite video games of all time, and I mean that sincerely. I don't say this lightly, but so much about this game is borderline perfect in my eyes. The only things I'd ever want to change about it are nitpicks. I'll get the story out of the way now, and say that everything that gets set up throughout the entire franchise finally gets a payoff here. It's an incredible climax to a story 5 years in the making, and I'd love to say more, but I'm keeping that for the spoiler section. So instead, let's talk about everything this game does right outside of that, because believe you me, there is a lot. Gameplay has been completely reworked, gone are attack areas and button inputs in favor of a more traditional system. However, this hardly means that they lose strategic depth or mechanical complexity. Far from it. The boost system still exists and is better than ever before. Now there are no longer any weird conditions you have to meet to be able to use it once the meter is full. You can just boost multiple times on the same turn on the same character at that. You can also save up boosts and use them in order to execute a very strong special attack. So there's an added layer of strategy depending on whether you'd rather risk using your boosts to get turns now and hope you can end the fight quickly, or save up your boosts for a strong move that can guarantee a kill. And on top of this, they also added a new system, the break gauge. Every time you take or deal damage, you and the enemy respectively accumulate break points represented by a red meter. Once it's full, you get staggered. The stronger the move, the more it'll add to the break gauge, though some attacks are explicitly there to deal massive break damage, such as Ziggy's choke. Please ignore the sound, he's definitely not breaking this child's neck. I think break is awesome because it adds another layer of resource management and strategy. Maximizing break on enemies, especially bosses, can be critical to effectively beating them, and if you happen to have save data from Saga 2, you start off with a special armor for Shion that not only gives her back the Vector uniform from Saga 1, but also boasts the highest break defense in the game. And since we're already on the subject of armor, I may as well mention that equipment for both characters and ES units now functions like in a normal video game, instead of being a mishmash of mishandled ideas like in Saga 1 and 2. Better late than never, I guess. Now, the new gameplay is great and all, but say you want to run from battles anyway. You finally can. No shitty caveat or anything, you can actually run from battles now, just like that. I don't know why the fuck it took them 8 fucking years to figure this shit out, but again, better late than never. By far my favorite thing about the game's combat, however, is the way they completely eliminate grinding. Remember those boost charge special moves I mentioned earlier? Killing an enemy with one results in an overkill, which greatly increases the EXP, money, and skill points they drop. Use this on a boss, and you never have to worry about grinding for levels until the next one, literally ever. It's tweaked just right, and I think more games should have a mechanic like this. There's a damn good reason why they went ahead and reused it in the Blade games. And since I already mentioned skill points, the skill tree is back, and functions as a sort of cross between the first two iterations, except this one doesn't suck. Every skill tree has 2 paths pertaining to 2 separate class types, which allows you to build your characters in one of the 2 preset ways, though there is nothing stopping you from making them a hybrid. This allows for proper player freedom in how to structure your party, without making proper setups a giant pain in the ass. Thanks to this, everyone is actually unique again, and choosing your party members has an actual merit, so it helps to make everyone equally useful, since you can still change out party members mid-fight. And say you want to give the tank in your party medica all anyway, well, you can. All throughout the game you can find these things called EX keys, which allow you to unlock new skills with your characters that they otherwise wouldn't be able to get. On the yes side of things, there were two major additions. The first is the new anima awakenings. As you fight, you slowly build up an anima gauge, and once it's full, you can unleash a special attack. It's essentially the mech equivalent of the tech attacks, and also how you achieve overkill in ES fights. The other is co-op attacks. You see, enemies now have elemental strengths and weaknesses that actually matter for once. Hitting the yes enemies with one of their weaknesses will cause your characters to gang up on them, which allows you to deal 2 turns worth of damage in a single one, and it tells that these fights are extremely cinematic, more so than anything else in the series. The mechs fly all around the place, and the camera gets set up appropriately, never staying static for too long. The fight choreography in the series in general is extremely cool. This goes doubly so for the fights and cutscenes. Just like in Saga 2, this shit is mocapped and it shows. Another change that was made to the gameplay that was made for both on-foot and ES segments is how the traps work. In the first 2 games, dungeons would be littered with canisters you could break to give enemies a debuff. Using them effectively was always kind of a pain in the ass, since you have to actively lure the enemy towards you first. In this game, there's something you can actively place down yourself, which actually makes them really useful this time around, without the caveat of having to lure an enemy to you and risking a preemptive encounter first. This is especially useful since starting a fight from behind also puts you at an advantage. The combat area design, environmental storytelling, visuals, and so on are all better than they ever have been before. Even the English dub is at its best here. You can tell the voice actors had enough time with their roles by now to really make their performances shine. Most of my complaints are nitpicks, but there are 2 that are bigger than others. Both of them have to do with how you get certain characters' ultimate weapons. You see, in this game you can get so ridiculously busted in the endgame that you can beat the entire finale of it without ever taking as much as a single point of damage. Doing the side quests and exploring the world gives you access to things like super bosses, which in turn reward you with insane gear, like a ring that makes it so every Ether attack only uses a single Ether point, and of course ultimate weapons for every party member. Here's the problem. For Ziggies you have to grind out 99 of a certain endgame item, which is a pain in the ass and honestly not worth it. And for juniors you have to beat one of the hardest difficulties in the minigame Haycocks, which is stupidly fucking difficult and I hate it here. However, it is also pretty pointless to get them because doing literally anything else will make you strong enough to kill every enemy within 3 turns and without ever taking damage. And yes, this includes the final boss. This actually segues nicely into another thing I've neglected to mention until now. There's minigames in this series, lots of them actually, and I've never played a single one that wasn't Haycocks. I'd show footage of them, but how the fuck would I do that if I've never played them? They're there if you're into that sort of thing, I guess, but personally I'll just stick to the main game. Now, before I move on to the books and ultimately the spoiler section, which will cover all the ground I neglected to mention thus far, I'd like to address the music. Yuki Kajiura went all fucking out with this soundtrack. Whilst I do prefer the second game's OST, this one is honestly just as good for very different reasons. A lot of 2's OST was bombastic and felt like an action movie. This game on the other hand goes for a much more somber and subdued tone, which seriously adds to the sense of finality of this game. It also does something no other game in the entire franchise ever did. It uses a constant leitmotif throughout. I'll get into this more in the spoiler section though, so as to not accidentally spoil something with it. Now before I continue, I'd just like to point out that one of the super bosses in this game is a rematch with the fucking Velpa from Xenogears, which you previously fought as a regular boss. I'd consider this a spoiler usually, but it literally just happens. No explanation given. The reason I mention this is because there's a very distinct feeling of how the actual fuck did they get away with this and not get sued by Square that's constantly present throughout the game, and they must have known because the theme for this battle is called Outrageous. Man, I love Saga 3, and yet it sold like utter shit. It had an incredibly strong opening week, coming second in the charts right after New Super Mario Bros. Of all things, and then it immediately dropped off to a ridiculous degree, selling only 333,000 copies worldwide. There's a damn good reason as to why the English version of this game is one of the 10 rarest games on the PlayStation 2. And since the series was never re-released, that's where all the games are unfortunately stuck. Unless you emulate or something, because let's be real, you're never finding a proper copy of this game for less than $300, and that really fucking sucks. Let's talk about the guidebooks for these games real quick before moving on to the final segment of this video. Xenosaga 1 Official Design Materials and Xenosaga Episode 3 Perfect Guide in particular. These are essentially the Perfect Works equivalent for Saga 1 and 3 respectively, and for the most part contain the same kind of content. While I wouldn't consider reading them to be necessary like with Gears, I do believe that Perfect Guides especially greatly enhances the world and story. So if you're in it for the long ride anyway, then you have absolutely nothing to lose by reading this as well. And this covers every single major piece of Xenosaga media ever released. If you, for whatever reason, watched this far and still somehow haven't played these games, then I now implore you to do so. For you, the video has ended, because from this point onward, there will be nothing but spoilers. Have a nice day, evening or night, yada yada, you know the story. See you when I talk about Xenoblade. Now, for everyone else who has gone on this frankly way too long journey, same as I have, let's talk about the one thing that makes it all worth it. Now let's talk about the Mission conflict. Can we talk about the Mission conflict? Please, I've been dying to talk about the Mission conflict all day, okay? This is quite possibly one of the most complex yet simultaneously cohesive conspiracy plots I have ever seen in a video game, and it's executed flawlessly. The first game mentions it and its impact on the characters multiple times, and it's heavily implied that Xion has some involvement with it, as well as showing you a couple glimpses of it throughout Xion and Junior's memories. Then in 2's opening you get to see a snippet of its final moments. The planet is completely in shambles, there's fights going on everywhere, and people are dying left and right. Get shown Jin and Chaos's roles in it, and then in Saga 3 you play through the entire thing, and each time you get more information. The giant web of connections slowly unravels, and yet every minor detail adds up perfectly. There's this really cool chart that shows all of the different factions and connections, and the full scope of this entire thing never really hit me until seeing it. The final moments of the Motion conflict in Saga 3 are also easily my favorite moments of the entire series. The entire city is burning. Everywhere you go you see buildings which mere minutes ago were full of life, now decrepit and desolate. People on the verge of death litter the streets, all while the music of the intro to Saga 2, aptly titled Assault, serves as the main backdrop to this entire event. And despite being already aware of what's going to happen, you're still actively pushed to maybe try and change something, until the realization creeps in that the worst possible outcome cannot be prevented. Everything about this part of the game is fucking incredible. About now is also when I should finally address Chaos as a character. Earlier I called him a wild card that takes traits from everyone in Gears. And this is true, as he's easily the single most important character in the party. As the origin of the powers of Anima, he serves the role as a contact, while his dynamic with Wilhelm is that of the antitype and the complement. He's extremely compassionate and a capable leader, but also always composed, which fits him both into Bart and Rico. And of course, he knows way more than anybody else, actively withholding information from everyone and justifying it as simply being a watcher of the events that unfold, making him basically yet another Satan equivalent. I find him to be one of the best parts of the series, because in spite of his relatively small role in the game's standalone stories, he always manages to sprinkle hints throughout, and his facial expressions during critical moments are always visible, and rarely anything other than pain. I just think he's awesome. And since I already mentioned Assault, that's another thing this game does incredibly well. Kajiura doing the music for both 2 and 3 allows for so many parallels by mixing certain themes and remixing certain songs. One really good example being Fatal Fight. This song gets remixed several times throughout both games whenever there's a confrontation between Jin and Margulis, and besides being one of the best fucking songs in the franchise, it's also one of the best ways the music enhances the story. In Saga 2, every time you hear the song, it gets gradually more chaotic and bombastic, as if the tension is constantly rising. But in Saga 3, it gradually gets more and more somber, resulting in this absolutely beautiful rendition of the theme when you confront Margulis for the last time on Mictum. By this point, both characters are aware that it doesn't matter who wins this, it's the last time they'll ever face each other, both having reached a low point in their life, with Margulis losing what's essentially his entire reason for being alive to begin with, and Jin seeing his former lover basically commit suicide whilst lamenting what could have been. It's not just fantastic in its own right, but also perfectly bookends the existence of the ES units throughout the games. The first time Fatal Fight plays was at the very end of the first ES section in the series, the last time at the final ES fight in the franchise. Let's also talk about the villains a bit. This is probably one of the aspects in the series I feel the most conflicted about. Much like in Gears, they all fit into several archetypes, and each serve as an inversion / foil to the main cast. On one hand, you have fantastic ones like Albedo, and on the other you have Kevin. Let's go through them in order of relevance. Margulis is Jin's antithesis, and the game's Ramses archetype stand-in. He doesn't really have many personal stakes in the story. Most of his arc revolves around his faith in Ormus, so once that disappears he doesn't know what to do anymore. He's true to himself and extremely straightforward in his plans, which is good because it's not hard to hate this motherfucker. His inferiority complex and obsession with being better than Jin are lifted directly from Ramses. However, where they differ is how their arcs conclude. Ramses was unable to move past his own problems and eventually broke down because of it, his fate ultimately unknown. Margulis on the other hand stands by his beliefs to the very end, deciding that it's better to die than live in a world that denies him his only desire. Albedo is much more interesting, since he serves as a major antagonist in one and as the main villain of two. Thanks to this, he gets a lot of screen time, and the way they write him is incredibly fascinating to me. If you were to just take Saga 1, you have this half-hearted attempt at a psychopath whose entire gimmick is just, look at how fucking insane I am, wahoo! Several friends of mine who didn't get past the first game ended up calling him pretentiously written, and I can kind of see why. The final Pesh scene in the first game is extremely memorable, but without the later context of the connections between Sakura and the URTVs, and in turn their connection to Yudu, it just comes off as the writers trying way too hard to sound smart, instead of being a genuinely terrifying scene. Archetype-wise, he's the it of this game, which I'd say is pretty self-explanatory. The Testaments are just kind of messy. There's only 4 of them, but that doesn't stop them from being pretty inconsistent in their quality. We already talked about Albedo, but then you'd have somebody like Voyager, who just kinda doesn't do a lot. Eric is a pretty interesting character in Pied Piper, but his motivations are basically non-existent in the main games, so his entire role as a Testament is reliant solely on his appearance in PP. There's also Kevin. He's basically a mix of Graf and Krelian, and I just don't like him. On one hand, he's meant to be hateable, but on the other, he just doesn't get nearly enough screen time for his eventual reveal as a Red Testament to have any impact whatsoever. His motivations are all over the place, and his eventual betrayal of Wilhelm just feels incredibly forced. By far the best of the Testaments though is Virgil. He's barely in the first game, and he may as well not be in the second, but his arc in 3 is fantastic, and the way it ties into Shion's actions throughout the first 2 games is also extremely clever. There's an irony in Virgil of all people, a man defined by contradictions, calling Shion out on being a hypocrite. It also helps that Fabronia has been built up for basically the entire series. There's also Yuriev. Everything about Krelian and Graf that Kevin doesn't have goes to him. He's probably my favorite of the villains in the series. His motivations are simple to understand and he's incredibly hateable. The way he's built up as a constant force throughout the entire franchise, before ultimately only opposing the party after they become a threat to his plans, is extremely well executed. It helps that his boss fights are some of the most badass moments in Saga 3. And then lastly there's Wilhelm. I have lots of mixed feelings about him. His intentions aren't necessarily malicious, more so that he finds resetting the world to be a necessity. He's essentially the complement / Miyang stand-in of this game like I mentioned earlier, being more of a force of nature than an actual individual, constantly working as a puppeteer behind the scenes. He serves his role as the ultimate antagonist really well, but I can't help but be a little disappointed at the fact that we never get to fight him once. And this brings me to another point tangentially related to ES fights. Saga 3 especially is full of how the fuck did they get away with this moments, like I mentioned earlier with the Weltall. Mai is literally just Maria. You straight up fight the party's Omnigears in Abel's arc, and Abel's arc itself actually looks like the Eldritch, and is literally just the final arena of gears, and Omega Res Novae is straight up just Deus, but with Weltall and Virge instead of angels as its hand. The list goes on, but you get the idea. The side stories are another part of why I really like the overarching narrative in these games. So many of them get carried throughout the games. For instance, meeting the relatives of characters from prior games is one thing, but some others are much more explicit. Like this side quest in the first game, where you can help a little girl grow flowers, which gets followed up in Saga 2, and of course, the Professor's plotline. In Saga 1 and 2, the Professor and Assistant Scott are entirely side characters, and meeting them is completely optional. But then in 3 they become actual cast members, and the tone of their sub-story shifts completely, from going from purely comedic to genuinely heartfelt, which is only made stronger by the fact that without them, KOS-MOS would never have been repaired, and everybody would have died in the Zarathustra dungeons, as every ES unit got absorbed by it, barring Asher as it uses Kaiser's core instead of just an Vessel of Anima. It's always the little things that make you appreciate the bigger picture, eh? Now, as I mentioned earlier, Saga 3 also has a frequent leitmotif, being its ending theme, Maybe Tomorrow. This song is fucking genius because it serves a double effect. The first is to give a sense of progression to the game's plot, tying together major moments in the story, such as the approach of the final area. By the time you hear the actual song and the credits, it kind of serves to remind you of all it is you just played through. And least of all, the time I Love You Sincerely played during the motherfucking Alan scene. You know the one. I could never talk about this game without mentioning the scene where Alan finally grows some fucking balls. This scene is so fucking good. But in the same way that the song puts a tie on the game itself, it also does so for the entire series. Joanne may not be singing the songs anymore, but there's a clear theme going throughout the credit songs of the 3 games, and it is entirely reflective of Shion's character arc. Note that this is merely speculative and my personal interpretation. However, from how I understand the songs, Pain is about her inability to let go of her grief about Kevin's death and closing her heart off to anybody else whilst using KOS-MOS as a sort of coping mechanism. Sweet Song is about her reminiscing about their time together, and the titular song being KOS-MOS herself. And lastly, Maybe Tomorrow is about her finally letting go and finding a way to move on, even if the future seems unsure. In that sense, the song is representative of the entire game. It ends on a note of uncertainty. Everybody has lost something valuable to them, most of all Wilhelm and Chaos, who have fulfilled their reason for existing in this world, one perpetuating an endless cycle and the other finally breaking it. But they're all looking forward to tomorrow, unsure of what it will hold. There are no unresolved plot lines. The only thing that's truly uncertain is what comes next. And that's exactly why Jin is one of my favorite characters. He's the kind of character who doesn't know how to properly communicate his feelings, which ended up leading to Pellegri's death, and it took until the very end for Shion to finally understand. But by then it was already too late, and it all culminates in his death. I'll let this scene play out in full. I know you've already seen it, but I do think that it's important for what I'm about to discuss.
静かだ。我が人生、思えばこれほど静かな時はなかったな。私はこれを求めていたのに、いざその時を迎えてみると、かつての喧騒が目まぐるしく変化する日々がむしろ懐かしい。だがこうしているのもまた心地いい。一足先に行ってますよ。シオン。
I won't lie, I cried while watching this on these replays. This scene is incredibly powerful. Until the very end, all of Jin's actions were born out of care for the people around him. And even if he was unable to properly make them understand, he dies content, knowing that thanks to him, they'll have a future worth living for. Chaos's expression at seeing his dead friend also just displays so much with absolutely no words. This is quite genuinely one of my favorite endings to any video game, and all of what I just discussed is perfectly represented in the final shot of the game after the credits. KOS-MOS, almost completely broken, drifting away to Lost Jerusalem, a blue shooting star on its way home. And yet people didn't like it back in the day. I remember reading about people thinking that it's too inconclusive, or that the game lacks the sort of finality the series needed by leaving things open. I really couldn't disagree more. I believe that the open-ended nature of the story fits perfectly with the series as a whole, because if you ask me, to answer the question in the video chapter's title, Xenosaga fundamentally is about people. It delves into the question of what it is that makes us human and repeatedly addresses the idea of letting go of the past and moving on, forging your own future as best version of yourself that you can be. Nobody knows what your future looks like, least of all you, so leaving the future of this world uncertain is in my opinion perfect, because beneath the space opera, beneath Mary Magdalene and Jesus Christ, beneath a cast of severely fucked up people, lies a story which couldn't be any more human if you tried. Xenogears might have ended on a note about loving humanity, but this series is all about that. Or maybe I'm just reading too much into things. That to me is what Xenosaga is all about. And you know what? Maybe to you all of this wasn't worth it, and you find the games to be pretentious and the religious imagery to be completely pointless like the reviewers at the time. And hell, maybe it is. But to me this series, and especially Saga 3, is something truly special, and an experience I wish I could have for the very first time, all over again. And thus concludes Xenosaga, a franchise as consistent as a roller coaster and as impactful as a bullet train. I truly love these games, and I do sincerely hope that we'll one day see them remastered, and in 1 and 2's case, ideally remade. I do believe that one or the other is going to happen sooner than later, considering Future Redeemed happened, and this year marked the 20th anniversary of the series, but even the off chance that it won't, this franchise as a whole will always hold a very special place in my heart. One marked by ups and downs, terrible games and masterpieces, and good characters, and Kevin Winnicott. But with everything finally said and done, my wearing thoughts have finally reached a conclusion, and it is time to end the video. So do me a favor here and have a wonderful tomorrow. See you on Ionis.
Until I could have my strength to wait for the light, maybe tomorrow.
So you like Xenosaga?
Yes.
What the is your problem?